joining. And we are starting today a little new subsection. We're going to take a little break from the Jewish history to go a little further back in history and discuss something that happened earlier. Get us a little break from all the bloody wars that were going on. We're going to learn a Megillah. It's not long, it's quite short, and I think it's very relevant and fascinating and has lots of ideas that will be wonderful for us to learn. So if we just look at a Tanakh, sorry, I just grabbed a Tanakh to explain how Torah is structured. We have what we call the 24 books of Torah, meaning there's the written Torah. We have, of course, the first 5 books, what we call the Chumash, the Torah. That was given to Moshe, to Moses, directly by God. And on the day of his passing, he wrote a scroll for each of the 12 tribes. So that was completed, and we received it on the day of his passing before we entered Israel. And that's the level of godly energy we call Torah. The next level, lower than that, but part of the broad spectrum of Torah, or more correctly usually identified as Torah shebichsav, the written Torah, to separate it from what we call the oral Torah, is a level called the prophets, the Nevi'im. Within the prophets, we have 2 sections. We have the early prophets and the later prophets. The early prophets are Joshua, Samuel, the era of the judges, the era of the kings, right? Yoshua, Shoftim, Shmuel, Shmuel Beis, Melachim Aleph, Melachim Beis. So we have first Joshua. It's almost like history, but it's all prophecy. It's not a history book. Prophecy is not a history book. We don't have everything recorded. We have hundreds of years not noted. We have small details that are expounded upon because it's not history. It's God's word. Joshua, Yoshua, Shoftim, the era of the judges that we spoke about in our history class, and we're going to delve into now with far more depth. The era of the judges lasted 350 years. We're going to be discussing something that happened about 250 years into the 350 years. And then we have Samuel, which is 2 books, Shmuel, and then the kings. We have King Saul, we have King David, we have King Solomon. All of that is not a history book. It's all prophecies. Now, we have to understand the Jewish people had over 1 million prophets. We know there are recorded 55. There were over 1 million prophets that had prophecies. Maybe they were prophets their entire life. I mean, once they reached the age and the stage of being a prophet, maybe they were prophets for 30, 40, 50 years. Maybe they were prophets that people came to all the time to gain counsel, to know what's going to be in the future. There were over 1 million such prophets, but we don't know about them. We only know of 55 prophets. The 55 prophets we know are prophets whose prophecies were enduring for us to learn from as well. What the sages call L'dairos, for all generations. So when we have a prophecy for generations, in other words, God gave a prophet a prophecy, but it's for us as well to know that such a prophecy was written down. And there's 55 prophets whose prophecies were written down from over 1 million prophets. Because in the time of the prophets, that was the ultimate aspiration. If nowadays it's to be a rabbi in the world of Chabad, it's to be a Lubavitcher emissary, a shliach, in the certain segments of the Orthodox world today, it's to sit and learn in what's called kollel for 20, 30 years. In those days, it was to be a prophet. That was as close as you could get to God. And the people were on a very high level. That's something very important to remember. I know I'm going to mention it many, many, many times. The closer you get to Sinai, the closer you get to the revelation of God at Mount Sinai, the holier we assume the generation was. Which is why a later sage can never argue with a prior sage. Even if he's a big sage and he was a little sage, doesn't make a difference. If this one preceded me chronologically, I can't argue with him. He's that much closer to Sinai than I am. He's that much closer to God's revelation on planet Earth. Nowadays, we're 3,332 years from Sinai. It's a long time. In these days, they were a few hundred years from Sinai. So there was a very, very high level people. And what they wanted was God. And to be really close to God, you were a prophet. God spoke through you. So that was what everybody wanted to be. Like I'm saying, if in the world today, if in the secular world you want to be, I would say lawyer, doctor, accountant, but probably now it's more like a entrepreneur. In some Orthodox world, to sit and learn Torah for 30 years. In the Chabad world, to be an emissary. In those days, they wanted to be a prophet. And there were over 1 million of them, but we only know 55. So we have the earlier prophets, the prophecies that were written down in the book of Joshua and the book of the Judges, which span those 350 years that we're going to be discussing today, the Samuels and the Kings. And then we have the later prophets that were more not as time-bound, but are discussing either prophecies of rebuking the Jews or prophecies of comforting the Jews. And we have most famous ones are Isaiah, Yeshaya, the prophet who speaks so much about the redemption of Mashiach, Yirmiyah, Jeremiah, Yechezkel, Ezekiel, and then we have many, many, many other prophets that are smaller prophecies, meaning we don't have as much ink on them, like Micha and Savanya and Habakkuk and other such prophets, Haggai. So we have the era of the prophets. And then we have another section of Torah that's called the writings. Now, all this is part of the written Torah. All of this together is 24 volumes. It's one work, the 5 of the Torah, the early and later prophets, and the writings. In the writings, we have Psalms, right? We know that. The book of Tehillim, the book of Psalms, one of the probably most used books besides the 5 books of Moses, besides the Torah itself, definitely has enormous power to draw down God's kindness and compassion. It's one of the writings. We have within the writings the 5 Megillos, the 5 scrolls, the 5 books. The reason they're called Megillah, we're not going to get into that. We have within the Megillos, I'm looking inside, so I should say this wrong. Eov, Job. Oh no, Eov and Job are still not Koheles. No, that's not the Megillas. Sorry. Eov is not a Megillah. I was looking inside. So I have Megillas Esther, what we know from Purim. Daniel. No, this is not written in the right order. I'm looking inside, but this is not written in the right order. I have a Tanakh in front of me, so I shouldn't make a mistake. But the Tanakh isn't written in the right order, so this wasn't printed correctly. So forget this. This Tanakh was not written in the right order. We have Megillas Esther, Megillas Rus, Megillas Eicha. I'm trying to remember which of the other 2 are considered the Megillas. I can think of the title, I'm not sure which are the 2 of the Megillas, but I do believe there are 5. So these are a subsection of the writings. Why am I explaining all this? Because we're going to be learning one Megillah. It's called Megillas Rus. So again, we have the written Torah, 24 volumes, 5 books of Torah, the early and later prophets, and then the writings. The writings are also written with prophetic spirit, as are the books of prophecy, as of course is the Torah itself. But the Torah itself is a direct word of God. God dictated and Moses wrote. The prophets is written with prophecy. The writings is written with a form of prophecy, but lesser than the writings of the prophets. So the prophets is a higher level prophecy. The writings is a lower level prophecy. It's still prophecy, but it's a lower level prophecy. And all of that in totality is considered what the Christians will call the Old Testament, what we will call the written Torah, what in English they sometimes refer to as the scriptures. And within that is the book of Rus. And the book of Rus is very short, very powerful, and has a lot of very relevant lessons that I thought we would appreciate to take a sort of break from what we were discussing until now. And then we can go back to it, but at least we got a little breather of different ideas. Any questions on anything I said so far? Because I'm trying to give you just an overview to understand where this book fits in. Okay. Are any of you here familiar with the Book of Ruth? Do any of you know the story? Okay, great. We're all on the same page. That's awesome. The easiest way to study. So I'm not going to really, I don't believe, okay, from a does. All right, one out of everyone else. I'm not going to say the whole story tonight. And I really want to give you the background to understand the story. I don't believe we're going to get into the story tonight. We'll see. But I'll give you enough of the background just to a little bit understand the story so you'll understand the background to the story. So this is in the time of the judges. We said the judges was 350 years. We learned the judges. We discussed that in our Jewish history course. And generally, we said it was a very good time for the Jewish people, meaning the Jews were by and large good. It's called the Book of the Righteous, the Judges, because the Jews were generally righteous. I mean, they survived for 350 years without a monarchy. There was no central authority. There was nobody they paid taxes to, nobody they had to serve, nobody that gathered an army, nobody that had control. It was a country, so to speak, without controls. There was a judge, but he was only a judge. And yet, by and large, they did it. You know, they were good, they were righteous, they followed the judge, and they merited God's favor. And then sometimes they fell, and when they fell, the nations around would attack them, and then they would repent, and then God would redeem them, and then they'd be good for a while, and then they might fall again, and then the nations would attack and oppress them, and then they repented, and then God redeemed them. That's sort of a cycle we see throughout the judges. But there were long stretches of them being good, pocketed by them falling, and then the nations all around attacking and oppressing, which aroused their repentance and return to God. So that was basically the era of the judges. At the end of the era of the judges, the very end, how did the era of the judges ended is when the people asked God for a king, as we're going to discuss possibly today, why they wanted a king, what was the problem with wanting the king, is it right, is it wrong? We'll get to that. I do believe we touched on it in Jewish history, this concept of the transition from the judges to the kings. But I think we're going to go into it in a lot more depth now to understand this era. But the book of Ruth is in one of the low times, meaning by and large, it was a good time, spiritually speaking, but there were low ebbs. The book of Ruth occurred in one of those ebbs. And what happened, and I'm going to tell you again very briefly, in like 2 sentences, the story, and then I'll give you the background behind the story, and then we'll start learning the story. So, in the book of Ruth, Ruth was the matriarch that ultimately headed the house that produced King David, King Solomon, and ultimately Mashiach. Ruth is a very pivotal woman in Jewish history. Ruth was the epitome convert. She so epitomizes a convert, and when we discuss her, we might explain why, probably will, that many people have the custom. Chabad does not have this custom, but many Jews have the custom on the holiday of Shavuos, when we receive the Torah. In a sense, we all converted to read the book of Ruth as relating to that ultimate convert that we all became by the giving of the Torah 3,332 years ago. She was a very incredible woman whose impact is still felt today. And there's much we can learn from her. Many converts, women, choose the name Ruth as she epitomized what it means to be a righteous convert. So the background behind the story is there was a famine in the land. The reason for the famine was because Jews were not doing what they should be. This was a low time in a generally righteous era. Now, just to put in perspective, and we're going to discuss this more soon, a low time is relative. Their low time could be like our high peak of spirituality. They were a very high level people. As we see, for 350 years, they lived without a king. That's pretty impressive. Imagine a country without an organized system of rulership for 350 years. That's saying a lot about the level of the people. They were basically ruled by God. But this was a low time, which is far higher than our highs. Their low is probably higher than our high, but it was a low time. And because the Jews were sinning and weren't properly listening to God, there was a tremendous famine. And as really indicative of this low time, there was a very honorable family, a very noble, prestigious family, a very wealthy family that fled the country during the famine, which was horrific, which was horrible. which was an embarrassment to the whole tribe. This was Elimelech. He was a very noble person, very great lineage, very wealthy, very learned, very honorable. And he's like, I don't want my family to sit here in a famine. The neighboring countries have food. I have the money to travel. I'm going out. He picked up his wife, he picked up his sons, and he left. And he went to a neighboring country called Moab. So the family from Beis Lechem, Elimelech's family, and they went to Moab. A very great sin. Very, very, very wrong, abandoning their brothers in famine. Very wrong. But again, very wrong is relative. It doesn't mean he wasn't a noble, learned, good person. He wasn't a bad person. He made a bad choice.
Question.
Sure.
We learn in Torah that when there was famine, Hashem told our
Avram to leave.
To leave the land and go to Egypt. So why at that time it was the right thing to do, and why this is considered to be not such a
because he abandoned the other Jewish people. Meaning, if God gave you the gift of wealth, which he had, he should have used, instead of using his money to secure himself and his family, take care of himself, he should have used his resources to help his brothers. And it's very, very demoralizing. If you can imagine, I don't know, let's take Corona, but heighten the intensity of its effect, the fear factor and everything. And then like the rabbi of your community leaves because he can't handle it. And you're like, whoa, like where's our leader? He ran away from us. He's supposed to help us in this time of pain. He's supposed to support us. He's a leader. We look up to him. What's he running away from us for? If you're a real leader, you stay with your flock. So Elchanan, who is the person we're talking about here, the head of the family, it's not that he had a specific position and he ran away, but he was important. He was one of the important, honorable, good, he was a good person. Good, noble people, very good lineage, very, very impressive lineage. And you're not supposed to just think about yourself in these times. You're supposed to think about the Jewish people and your impact on the Jewish people. Like if you're panicking, if you're at work and you're a manager, you're a supervisor, and the company is like having great crisis, and you show everyone that you're panicking, so all the people under you for sure will panic. You're supposed to be strong, you're supposed to be calm, you're supposed to say it's okay and everything's fine. If everyone asks you, you have no clue what they're talking about, everything is fine. You have to give that confidence and that strength so everyone can move forward. So when Elchanan picked up and ran away to protect himself and his family, again, we might learn some deeper concepts, but I'm just giving you now the superficial story, which also is true. If he just picked up and ran away, it was tremendously demoralizing to all the people around him. He's running away? What does that mean? What does he think is going to happen to us? And why isn't he staying with us? And why isn't he using his resources to help us? In the time of the destruction of the temple, which we were a little bit before in Jewish history, there were 3 very wealthy men in Jerusalem that had enormous storehouses of food. And they pledged their storehouses to sustain the people throughout the siege. They knew what happened. We're not going to talk about what happened then. I mean, that's a separate situation. But that's what's expected of a Jew. Maybe it's not how the world demands, but that's how Jewish ethics is viewed. If other people are in trouble, you can't just take care of yourself. You have to do whatever you can for everyone. That's actually the criticism, if you want to use that word, on Noach, that he was a survivor of the great flood. Him, his wife, his 3 sons, his 3 daughter-in-laws, 8 people. And Noach was incredibly righteous. But the complaint is, as the saying is, he was a very righteous person in a fur coat. A fur coat implying he was very warm. But if it was very cold outside and you're wearing a fur coat, the only one warm is you. Abraham, he didn't wear a fur coat. He lit a fire. So all the people around him should be warm as well. Not just that he should have a relationship with God, but whoever he could touch should have a relationship with God. So at the same token, if it's a famine, it's not right that you should be full and your neighbor should be hungry. You should be a little hungry and your neighbor should have some food to eat. It actually discusses this in Jewish law, this concept that if it is a famine, if there's food, how much you're allowed to keep yourself, how much do you have to give to other people? Now, if there's a piece of bread and whoever gets it is going to live and the other person is going to die, you're allowed to keep it. But if there's extra food that will make you more full, but someone else desperately needs it, you've got to give it away. You can't just eat when other people don't have food. So Elchanan leaving at that point was considered deserting the Jewish people. Not that he converted, not that he became an idolater, but he was considered deserting them in a very practical sense, both not giving them his wealth and morally crushing them by his departure, by his saying, I'm checking out, I got to save my own skin. So he went from Bethlehem to Moab. Moab, an incredibly corrupt nation that we're told God didn't destroy because Rus was going to come from it. There's a saying of our sages, because of two good doves, a dove symbolizing something very pure and very righteous, Rus from Moab, and another convert, Naamah from Ammon, God had mercy on these two huge nations of Ammon and Moab and did not destroy them. Moab existed for 700 years because one pure soul was going to emerge, and that pure soul was Rus. So because of Rus, this entire nation lasted for 700 years. An evil nation, from its roots evil, a very, very evil people. But there was one very pure person that was going to emerge from it. And for the sake of that pure dove of Rus, the entire nation of Moab was spared for 700 years. And because of another pure convert that would come several generations later, Naamah, who married King Solomon, so you could see it was about 4 generations later, the entire nation of Ammon was also spared. Also a very evil nation. Moab was even worse. But they both were evil nations, and they were both spared because of these two pure converts that were going to come from them. So we're not going to say that much of the story now because this is the introduction before we learn the story. But because you know nothing, I got to explain a little bit so you understand the introduction. So Elimelech goes to Moab, and there his sons marry 2 Moabite princesses, one of which was Rus, the other one's name was Orpah. And obviously the sons did not become idolaters, the sons stayed loyal to God. These women underwent some type of conversion, and they married them. And then God strikes, and Elimelech passes away, and the 2 sons pass away. And the widow, Elimelech, and he loses all of his wealth. Basically, God was punishing him for abandoning the Jewish people. So he loses all his wealth, he dies, his sons die, everything's down the drain. So we have the wife of Elimelech. Her name was Naomi, a very, very, very righteous woman, a very great holy woman. And she said, okay, she's going home. She's got no reason to stay in Moab. She doesn't have any money to preserve. The money's gone. The famine's over anyway. She lost her husband. She lost her 2 sons. She's going home. And again, we're not going to go into all the details, but Rus goes back with her. Rus was loyal to her mother-in-law and loyal to God. And she abandoned her life. She was a princess. That's why she married this very wealthy man. When she married him, he was very wealthy. Now they've got nothing. But instead of going back home to her father and forgetting this and going back to being a princess of Moab, whatever it meant to be a princess in those days, she said, no, I'm not abandoning you. I'm not abandoning you. I'm not abandoning God. I'm going back. And I was like, I've got nothing. We're going to be beggars. Nobody even likes me back home. Right? They're all mad at us that we left. And then I come back and they're all dead and we're poor. What are they going to think? Goes to show you. You come back to nothing. Stay here. I said, I'm going with you. And Rus goes with Naomi back. And through a series of events I'm not going to tell you now, we'll keep something for suspense, Rus eventually marries the leader of the Jewish people at that time and produces the child that was the ancestor of David, that's the ancestor of Mashiach. So there's a lot of amazing things going on in this very, very short book. But that's enough of a background to give you now the introduction. If anything I say makes no sense because you don't know enough of the story, let me know. So again, understanding this, Rus, we're looking at the idea of the ultimate convert. So that's going to be one of the themes we're going to discuss. And we're looking at the seeds of Mashiach. From Rus, ultimately comes Mashiach. And again, as we can see, God works in mysterious ways. If you ever want a story that proves how God works in mysterious ways, this is the book to learn. Of course, Esther also brings out that point, and there's a lot of parallelisms between the story of Esther and the story of Rus, though they're very, very different. But in both of them, you really see God's very mysterious hand. So the first thing we said is God had a lot of historical perspective. Because really, Moab and Ammon should have been destroyed when the Jews entered Israel. They were completely evil nations. They just deserved to be destroyed. Other nations were destroyed then, right? Og Melech HaBashan, Bashan was destroyed. Sichan HaMori, the Amorim were destroyed. Why were Moab and Ammon destroyed? They were so evil. Their roots were evil. They're the product of incestuous relationship, horrible stuff. Because of Rus from Moab, because of Naamah from Ammon. We see God's thinking. I'm going to allow an entire nation, however many hundreds of thousands of people, to live and sin for 700 years. I'm allowing it to happen. You're saying, what are you, spaced out? Why are you allowing this horrible nation to exist? Because I have far-sighted vision. Because I know there's a very special soul that's going to emerge from this evil. And for her sake, it's worth it. I could destroy them later. And that was Rus from Moab and Naamah from Ammon. Another saying of the sages, it's very good to remember when we begin learning this, that's one saying of the sages. Another saying of the sages is that there were two women from whom were built the seed of Judah and from whom descended King David, King Solomon, and King Mashiach. Those two women were Tamar and Rus. Both acted properly in order to do good with the dead. That's actually a quote from the Zohar. I'm not going to explain to you now what it meant both acted properly to do good with the dead. Maybe I'll just touch on a little bit to understand the concept. These two women historically, Tamar and Rus, there's a very strong similarity between the two, though most people might not make the connection. The Zohar, of course, which is encompassing scope, sees in these two women that, very different periods of time and situation, but there's a lot of commonality. The main points of commonality are that both were very righteous, perfectly righteous women. They both were the ancestors of Mashiach. From Tamar and Yehuda's relationship came the line from which came Boaz, who married Rus, from which came Yishai, from which came David, from which came Solomon, from which came Mashiach. So these two women are pivotal players in bringing Mashiach. And in both of them, the stories don't look good. In both of them, as we say, people are whispering in the corners and talking bad. We're not going to spend a long time now on Tamar. I do know we've touched on her story. We have spoken about Tamar at some point, but maybe a little while ago. Tamar was another commonality that explains the story of Tamar and Rus to understand what the Zohar is saying here. They said the Zohar said both of them acted properly. The common view of the people on the street corners was that they both acted improperly. Torah says they acted properly. And both of them were doing kindness with the dead. Meaning both of them, the improprietary behavior, if you will, had to do with a mitzvah called yibum. I do believe we have touched on the concept of yibum in this class. I'm going to remind you of it briefly. As we discussed it, of course, in the book of Rus, we'll discuss it much more at length. But just to understand what the sages are saying here, there are two commandments in the Torah. They're biblical. They're written in the Torah. One's called yibum, and one's called chalitza. This commandment comes to play in a very unique and rare situation. If a man never had children, legally or illegally, never had any children, but was capable of having children, meaning an infertile man or married to an infertile woman wouldn't count. The man's capable of having children, the woman's capable of having children. It just didn't happen, which is sort of rare, because if they're capable, why didn't they have children? So usually this would mean like a tragedy where someone got married and the husband passed away very soon after the marriage. In such a case, there is a mitzvah for nowadays the brother of the deceased man to marry this widow, to produce a child. So again, she has to be capable of having children. If she's not, then the whole thing doesn't apply. And that child is spiritually carrying on the dead brother's legacy. So again, it's a very rare situation, because if a husband passes away and the couple's childless, usually they're childless because they can't have children. But if they can't have children, that doesn't count, and the whole mitzvah doesn't apply. It only applies where the man's capable of having children and the woman's capable of having children, and they didn't have a child. And he never had a child, never had any previous relationship, legitimate, illegitimate, he never had any descendants. At this point, there's a mitzvah on the woman to do one of two things: to marry his brother, if he has a brother, and the child that will be born will be an extension of this dead man, or if she doesn't want to marry the brother, or if the brother doesn't want to marry her, there's a different mitzvah you can do called chalitza, which is a ceremony in which the two become disengaged from each other. Nowadays, we do not allow the mitzvah of yibum, because the rabbis don't feel that people are on level to get married solely to help a dead man. The Ashkenazic rabbis forbade it a long time ago, long time ago, over 1,000 years ago. The Sephardic rabbis forbade it about 100-some years ago. The reason why the Sephardic rabbis allowed it far longer than the Ashkenazic is because conditions were easier in the Sephardic countries. They were less persecuted by the Christians. They didn't have Christians around them. The Muslims were less harsh than the Christians, much less harsh. Of course, there were periods, as we could learn historically, when the Muslims rose up in a lot of fanaticism and were very vicious and cruel to the Jews, but those were isolated pockets of time. Most of the time, it was pretty okay under the Muslims, and it was pretty horrific under the Christians. So in the Muslim countries, it was easier. The people were wealthier. Life was more comfortable. So it was possible to imagine a man having the ability to truly marry a woman to help his dead brother out. But in the Ashkenazi countries, the rabbi said, no way, life is way too hard. If a man's marrying a woman, he wants the woman. And that's not the point of this commandment, so you can't do it anymore. And the Sephardic countries, in the early 1900s, the Sephardic rabbis also said, by now, we just don't think you're holy enough and spiritual enough to marry someone that both of you are thinking about the dead man and to help him out. But Tamar, who was married to one of Yehuda's sons who died, and then another one of Yehuda's sons who died, and was supposed to get married to the third son, and Yehuda was thinking, this woman, there's something about this woman, her husbands keep dying, I'm not giving her my third kid. He didn't know the real story, that both of his sons were sinners, and Tamar was very righteous. So Tamar created a situation, with God's help pushing the situation along, that unwittingly Yehuda had relationships with her, from which came the line of David, the line of Mashiach. So a lot of people on the side, people love to yap, to yenta, to talk, to gossip, to talk bad about people. We're like, oh my gosh, what a bad story. What he did, what she did, what he did, what she did, what he did, what she did. Not knowing that this was done with the purest of intent, and ultimately to bring out David and to bring out Mashiach. Similarly, Rus. Again, we're not going to go into the whole story now to understand what the people were yapping about, but we'll learn about it in detail. But when Rus came back with her mother-in-law, Naamah, wait, there's a mitzvah of Yibum here. Now, nowadays, Yibum is basically with the brothers. But at that point, it was broader. It was with the closest relative. I mean, nowadays, of course, they don't do Yibum at all. But for a long time, Yibum was only with the brothers. But in early times, it was with the closest relative. And Rus's husband was dead, He was capable of having children. She was capable of having children. They didn't have children because he died so shortly after they got married. So once she's back in Israel, there's a mitzvah called Yibum or Chalitza. But the problem was nobody wanted to do it with her because they weren't really sure if her conversion was valid, as we'll discuss why they doubted her conversion. In the end, the case was brought to the judge, the ultimate judge, whose name was Boaz, as we refer to him in this book, though he's referred to differently historically. And he and his court ruled that her conversion was valid. And the man that she was hoping would do this Yibum Chalitza with her was still, I'm not interested, no, I don't want to do it with you. And Boaz said he would. Oh, now everyone's talking. Oh, you see what happened? Boaz wanted this pretty girl. He decided her conversion's valid. It was all to get married. They get married. And the next morning, Boaz is dead. And everyone was like, oh, you see, God punished him. What was he thinking? But that's not what's happening at all. At all. Boaz was absolutely pure. Ruth was absolutely pure. And God kept Boaz alive to have this one night with Ruth, that from her should be able to come the line of David, the line of Mashiach. So in both of these cases, and that is what the Zohar is saying in linking these two women, people look and judge and talk. It's a great lesson for us how we could totally misconstrue what's going on. They look and they talk and they know everything. They know nothing, but they think they know everything. And they badmouth and they badmouth and they badmouth. Both of these women and men involved were absolutely pure. This was all God's divine design. This was all to bring out Mashiach. So both of them were doing it in a Yibum concept. Both of them were doing it with holy intent. God was very pleased with both, and everyone spoke bad about them. So sometimes it's also in life for ourselves as well. Sometimes we do good, and nobody really understands but God. And we have to say, okay, I'm in good company. I'm not the only misunderstood person in the world. I'm not the only person in the world that's meaning well and doing good, but nobody really gets it. Nobody really knows what I'm going through. Nobody really understands why I'm doing what I'm doing. People are looking bad at me. People are looking at things with a bad eye. They just don't know the real story. And we just have to keep walking and be confident that if we know we're doing the right thing, that's all that counts. It's between you and God ultimately. Doesn't make a difference anyone else's opinion. So the third important saying of our sages, this is from the Midrash, that sort of sets a background understanding of this book, is the Midrash says, the tribes are occupied with the sale of Joseph, right? Joseph was sold. Joseph was occupied with his sackcloth and fast. Reuven, for a different reason, was occupied with his sackcloth and fast. Yaakov, was occupied with his sackcloth and fast because he was mourning the passing of, or the disappearance, death of Joseph. Yehuda was occupied with taking a wife, which was ultimately led to Tamar. And God was occupied in creating the light of King Mashiach. So a lot of stuff is going on. A lot of crazy stuff is going on. A lot of confusing stuff is going on. A lot of stuff that makes no sense is going on. And God has it all mapped out. And it's all about the coming of Mashiach. And so too now. I often wonder what Megillas HaGeula will look like. This is Megillas Rus, there's Megillas Esther, we read that on Purim, there's Megillas Eicha, we read that on the 9th of Av. What's going to be Megillas HaGeula? Who's going to write it? The document that's going to chronicle the redemption. There's a lot of crazy stuff going on in our world. Today, we could call it Corona, we could call it riots, we could call it elections, we could call it vaccines. We got a lot of stuff that make a lot of people crazy. And we have no clue what's flying. And God is plotting how to bring Mashiach. So that's something we see very, very strongly in this book. Very strongly, this concept that we have no clue. We look and don't understand. Elimelech ran away, a tragedy. Naomi loses her husband, her sons, they become impoverished, a tragedy. This young girl that we don't even know if she's Jewish is walking around pretending she's Jewish. Who believes her? Finally, from rags to riches again, she gets married to the judge and then he dies. What's going on? What's going on? What's going on? What's going on is God is emerging the soul of Mashiach. What's Corona about? What's the turmoil over the vaccine about? What's the riots about? What's the craziness of elections about? God is emerging the soul of Mashiach. The process often comes through the back door. It's explained Kabbalistically that because Mashiach's energy is so intense, the way God can slip it into our world is through the back door. Which means critical stage by critical stage by critical stage in the process of the emergence of Mashiach, there's a lot of weird stories. There's a lot of stuff that don't look kosher, done by very holy people. And if you really learn it with all the, commentary, everything written in the Talmud about it, you see it was kosher, but it looks so not kosher. And the question would be, why is God doing this? Why would God choose to take holy people that have such good intentions and put them in the situations that they look so not kosher? Why is God doing that? I mean, you want to emerge the soul of Mashiach, there must be a simpler way of doing it than this. God says, no, I've got to get that soul in through the back door. I've got to get the soul in without the opposition of the evil forces. So I'm creating such stories. The evil forces are having a heyday. They think life is great. They don't know. This is another step. This is another step. This is another step in bringing Mashiach. So the story with Tamar and Yehuda was the first. And the story with Rus and Boaz is the second. And it continues. David and Bathsheba, Shlomo and Naamah. It continues. Because again, the same thing. If we're bringing down such a holy energy, we've got to make sure it works in a way that the evil doesn't even realize. That's actually an explanation in general, to decontextualize a little, of why sometimes God brings very holy souls to very bad places. If you want to go all the way back to the roots of the Jewish people, the most classical example is Abraham. Abraham was born to two of the most, at that time, wicked people in the world. His father eventually repented. I don't know what happened to his mom. Maybe she passed away before, because we don't hear that she repented, and we don't really hear. So I assume she passed away before this happened. But when Abraham was born, his father promulgated idolatry. He wasn't just an idol worshiper. He pushed it. And his mother's name was a Mislay. A Mislay, if you break it down into Hebrew, means falsehood, deception. Emes lo. Her name, her identity was false. And these two people were given the soul of Abraham, who brought monotheism to the world, who's the father of mankind's belief in one God that has no form and has no image. Abraham, given to them. Why? So there's a lot of answers. And one answer would be exactly this concept that we're saying, that to get such a great soul into this world, you got to sneak it in a way that the evil forces are caught unaware, as we use the concept of tricking the evil forces. So you take the greatest soul, one of the greatest souls of all times, and you give it to the two most evil people in the world. They're like, hey, this is pretty good. We're really happy. God knows what he's doing. Of course, God's not only limited by this, because this is not Christianity. Evil has no independent power. Everything is God. So obviously, God doesn't have to be limited to the forces of evil's, conniving. There's obviously a reason from God's end, and there's a reason from the soul's end. If this is an area that needs tremendous rectification, an area that's so evil, you need to send a really great soul there, because only a great soul can go in and get out and emerge from that evil. And from God's end, if this place has such evil, that means everything in energy works like a pendulum. So if there's such evil, there's such godly energy. But how to extract it? How to release it? You need a very powerful soul to be able to go in and extract those sparks buried within the evil. So God really needs a very great soul to go in there. And a very great soul is the only soul that could be sent there because that's the only soul that could emerge and handle it. And at the same time, we're giving a nod to the forces of evil and saying we have to sneak it in. It all works together. Which is why a Tamar and a Yehuda and Rus and a Boaz is part of the lineage of Mashiach. I know I poured a lot of information. Any questions? Let me see, there was a chat. Let me see, I didn't see it before. Okay. All right. So let's get a little background in our remaining few minutes. This was all the background to the background. So now you know we can begin the introduction to understanding this work of Rus. So it's interesting, if you look at the opening words of the book, of this work, it says, in the days of the judging of the judges, when the judges were judged, Shmuel, wrote this work. And he wasn't wasting his words, and he wasn't being poetic. And what did he mean by saying, in the days when the judges judged? You could say, well, he wanted to give us a historical timeline when the story happened. But he's being very vague if he wanted to give us a historical timeline when this happened, because we said the judges judged for 350 years. So it doesn't help me that much to know at some point in these 350 years, this story occurred. And the truth is, I know when it occurred. I told you, it occurred about 250 years into the 350 years, because we know who the judge was at that time. In this book, he's referred to by the name Boaz. In the Talmud, it identifies that Boaz was Ivtsan, who's recorded in the book of Judges. So if I calculate when Ivtsan lived, I know it was actually 259 years from the beginning of the era of the Judges. The era of the Judges began 25 years after the Jews entered Israel. So it's about 309 years from when the Jews entered Israel. I figured it all out. But I wasn't helped by the opening words that Samuel wrote, in the days when the judges judged. That didn't help me at all. So why did he write those words? So it's explained in the Talmud that he wrote those words to give us a moral backdrop to the story, not a historical one, a moral one. And this goes back to what I said before, that we had over 1 million prophets, recorded 55. It's not that those 1 million prophets didn't have very significant prophecies. They did, but they were for then. The 55 are for now as well. So this book, the prophecies of Rus, this book of the writings, is for now as well. And Samuel is opening up these words by giving us a moral context. What's going on? What's going on is, it was a time when the judges judged, when the judges were judged, when the people were not listening and obeying the judges. There were lots of judgments flying. The judges are trying to judge, the people are judging, the people aren't listening to the judges. It's a lot of chaos going on. And that created the moral backdrop of the story, meaning I told you it begins with a famine, right? There's a famine. That's why Elchanan runs away. And we discussed at length why that was so wrong. Why was there a famine? I don't know. Israel's a very dry country. Nothing's random. There was a famine because God made a famine deliberately as a response to the Jews' behavior. Now we see most of the time in those days, as I told you, the cycle is very obvious. The Jews mess up. Any of the foreign nations around them rise up, gain strength, conquer them, oppress them. The Jews are like, oh, God. They repent, and God sends salvation. And they're good for a while until they start forgetting. That was the normative cycle. But here God responded in a different way. He sent a famine. Maybe he sent a famine because he wanted to create a situation that would lead Elchanan to run to Moab. Why would he want him to do that? Because he wanted Rus to emerge. So we're looking and saying this makes no sense. And it did make no sense. But God knows exactly what's going on. I think that's a tremendous ultimate lesson to take from the book of Rus, is this point So many times in life, it looks like it makes no sense. And God knows exactly what he's doing. So there's a famine. Why was there a famine? Because the days when the judges were judging, meaning there was no central authority. Wait, I thought king was a problem. We'll discuss that. Obviously not today. But the Jewish people were at a point where they weren't listening to the judges. If they were, there wouldn't have been a famine. They weren't, and there was a famine. So that's the backdrop. That's the point. It's not a historical statement. It's a moral statement. This was a very chaotic point in Jewish history. Now, again, and I said it before, and I'm going to emphasize it again. Their chaos might be our virtue. These people were a lot closer to Sinai than we are. They were a lot holier than we are. And their sins are their sins because that's how they're judged. God judges people on their level. And their level was so high, and therefore even minor things they're doing wrong were looked at very, very, very strongly. And we see in the closing words, in the closing sections of the book of Judges, two really horrific tragedies that happened to the Jewish people, which again looked like the Jews were a horrible nation of horrific sinners. They weren't. Even at that time, they weren't. But compared to where they were supposed to be, they weren't up to that benchmark. And we see this very, 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 very often. It's very important to understand this before we start learning inside, because we're going to be talking about Elchanan's sin, this one sin, this one sin, this one sin. So we just want to keep in mind that even as we're saying sins, these people were really good people. They were really good. And again, like their sins could be our virtues. But compared to what they were supposed to be, it was very off. That's, I think, the point we're going to begin next week on, because I got like 2 minutes left. And I said I want at the end of each class to learn a law. So we'll stop at this point. And next week we'll start with this idea of this relative judgments, or how we could read in the books and the prophets and the Torah. It sounds like people are doing things so wrong, and they really aren't. But that's how they're being judged, because of what they're capable of. Which of course leads us to that other great principle that God really knows what we're capable of. We usually think far less, but God knows what we're capable of. And God really wants us to produce as per our abilities. And when we don't, we're falling short. So God knows every one of us incredibly well. He created us. He knows exactly what we're capable of doing. And he really, really wants us to give as we're capable of giving. And sometimes we could think, but so-and-so, but we all have a tendency to look at so-and-sos. And what are they doing? I'm doing so much compared to them. True. But who knows what you're really capable of? You a little and God a lot. And that's how he's looking at you. Okay, so with that, we're going to end our discussion on the introduction to Rus. And we're going to do a little bit of the law of Shabbos. It's exactly 9 o'clock. I'm just going to do this very briefly. There's a concept of remembering Shabbos all week long, sorry. And we see this how the sages live this way. It says that Shammai, who was a very great sage that we mentioned in Jewish history, so we all have a historical reference for Shammai, that he would every day, starting Sunday, he would go to the market, find the best looking piece of meat, the best looking cow, whatever it was, and he'd say, oh wow, this is awesome for Shabbos, I'm buying it for Shabbos. Well, it was Sunday. There was no refrigeration. So comes Monday and the ready doesn't look so good anymore. I mean, it's older, it's still very good. And he's like, I'm gonna find something even better. So Monday he went to the market and found something that looked even better, and he ate Sunday's food on Monday. And that's how he lived the whole week, eating for Shabbos. Because every day he went to the market looking for food for Shabbos. Just the next day there was food even better. And then that food got eaten, and that food was for Shabbos. So every day, it wasn't a game. He meant it sincerely. He was remembering Shabbos literally all week long. Now, obviously, it wouldn't apply exactly the same to us with everything frozen and processed, but the concept is there. The concept is remembering Shabbos. And therefore, some people, I'm not claiming to be one of them, but some people, over the course of the week, they'll do different things on different days. So every day there's a little remembrance of Shabbos. Maybe today you're going to get your fruits and vegetables, and the next day you're going to go to get your jewel items, and the next day you're going to clean, and the next day you're going to do your laundry. So all week long you're thinking about Shabbos each day because you're doing something because Shabbos is coming. Now, speaking about laundry, this is a injunction of Ezra, who we learned about in Jewish history. So hopefully you all know him. This is so wonderful that these great names are familiar to you. You have the historical context. So Ezra, as you remember, made several injunctions to reinforce the very weak structure of Jewish life in those days in Israel. Remember when he came to Israel and life was so broken down, dilapidated physically and morally. And one of the injunctions he said was, you're not allowed to do laundry on Friday. And the reason for this is because in those days, laundry took a long time. It'd be a whole laundry day. And he didn't want that was what was happening as you're supposed to be preparing for Shabbos. You're supposed to be involved in Shabbos, not in your laundry. So therefore, he literally forbade them from doing laundry on Fridays to make sure that it wouldn't take up all the time and they wouldn't be able to be focused on preparing for Shabbos. So nowadays, we generally throw it in a washing machine and throw it in a dryer, and it does not obsess our day. So there definitely is room to do laundry on Friday if you need to, though some people are careful and don't, to still honor this, even though, again, on a practical level, you are allowed to do it. And we're going to stop at this point. I hope that everybody enjoyed. And if you have any questions, always feel free to ask, and looking forward to seeing everyone next week. Have a wonderful week. Thank you for joining.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.